Three events happening here, actually. This is part of our Environmental Ethics Institute, which are lectures open to the public, and so I'd say we have a few members of the public here for Dick Barrett's talk. But this is also part of a National Science Foundation sponsored program called Debating Science. So if you look around, you have students from all over the country, as far away as New York, and California, and Iowa, Michigan, all over the place. And they're here to be learning about some of the ethical dimensions of scientific research and how to become better engaged in science debates. And much of these have to do with economics. We also have some students that are taking part in our Environmental Ethics Institute class with Andrew Luck. Really three things going on. It's my good fortune that Dick Barrett retired, because now I can ask him to do all kinds of things. And I've been doing that, actually. Dick is a longtime member of the UN faculty, an economist, a highly respected member, and a very thoughtful person. And he gave a version of this presentation last year. It was very, very good. So without further ado, Dick Barrett. And also, I almost forgot, tonight in this room, 7 o'clock, Dick is moderating a panel on the presidential candidates, Obama and McCain, and their positions on climate change, one of the most important issues, I think, of this upcoming election. So, Dick?
I think we still call them the presumptive presidential candidates. Dane has to say nice things about me because he always makes me talk right after lunch, when most people at this time of year are thinking about taking a dip in the river or doing something like that. What I'm going to try to do today is to give you some idea about how economics can be, should be, and is brought to bear on debates about the public implications of scientific issues. I should say that at the outset, I do not believe that the role of economics in such debates is much different than its role in debates about other issues without scientific content, welfare reform, say, or globalization. So my observations, for what they are worth, are going to be fairly generic. Where possible, I will try to illustrate my argument with issues of scientific interest, but if I find a better example elsewhere, bear with me. Let's start by considering the rather extraordinary claim, popular in the halls of business schools like this one, and economics departments, that economics explains everything. Now, nobody in his right or her right mind believes that. I would imagine rather that some of you in this audience would be more inclined to accept the propositions that string theory explains everything, although there are a lot of people, of course, who will say it doesn't explain anything, or evolutionary theory explains everything, or DNA explains everything, or what have you. Personally, I've reached the point in my own intellectual development or deterioration to think that nothing explains anything. But nevertheless, I think it is instructive to examine what it is that people are apparently claiming when they say that economics explains everything. Understanding the claim may shed some light on the role of economics in public discourse about contested issues. Even the most convinced proponent of economics will admit that the everything that gets explained is everything in the social realm. Economics cannot explain the extinction of Tyrannosaurus rex, or what dark matter is, or why the snows are disappearing from Kilimanjaro. So that those of you in the physical sciences can feel confident that an economist is not going to come poaching on your professional territory anytime soon. But to say that economics explains everything social, and to brush aside political scientists, sociologists, philosophers, historians, and so forth in the process, still seems to amount to a breathtaking intellectual imperialism. What's going on here? It's this. Economists believe, or at least assume, that all of us, that is, all of us people, in all aspects of our lives are rational, maximizing agents. In other words, we are always making decisions that to the greatest extent possible will make us better off. This type of behavior can be modeled with simple mathematics, and much of the economic theory consists of such modeling. Although to bamboozle the innocent and impress the cognoscenti, it's better to make the mathematics as complicated as possible. Formally, agents are said to maximize utility, which you can understand to be well-being or happiness or something of that sort. Originally, utility was thought of as something cardinally quantifiable. This dill pickle gives me 4 units of utility. But one of the intellectual achievements of 20th century economists was to recast utility theory in ordinal terms. This means that agents need only be able to express a preference between things. I prefer this dill pickle to that empanada. And utility numbers are ordinal, that is, they express preference orderings. In this context, a gain in utility simply means moving to a more preferred state. No matter how you think about it, utility has 2 important characteristics. One is that utility is inherently subjective, so that it is something that you experience, and that experience is unknown and unknowable to all others, who are accordingly unable to second-guess your judgments about what you think is good for you. In my teaching, I found that a lot of people like this aspect of utility theory. Indeed, I've never found anyone who has been willing to turn their money over to me in the expectation that I could spend it better on their behalf than they could themselves. A second, and for many people less plausible aspect of utility, is that it is undifferentiated by source. That is, things that you buy in markets, movies, pork chops, appendectomies, and so forth, and things that you come by in other ways, love, self-respect, experience of the world, all give the same sort of utility and can be compared for the amount of utility that they give. This implies, for example, that parents can actually state the number of, say, pork chop dinners that they would that would give them more utility than, and therefore they would prefer to the company of their children. This may be more than they can possibly eat or want to eat in their lifetimes. I certainly hope so. But the point is that they can entertain the question, or so economists supposes. The subjectivity and undifferentiatedness of utility have important implications, which I will talk about soon. But let's get back a moment to consider what the maximization of utility involves. Every choice we make involves trade-offs. When we choose something, we gain A and give up B. In economic life, it's pretty obvious. If you want to spend $1 more on food, you must spend $1 less on rent. Or not save $1 that could have bought food in the future. Or earn an additional food dollar by working more and giving up precious leisure time. Maximizing utility involves constantly assessing these trade-offs, searching for and taking advantage of the opportunity to gain more than you lose. Economists believe that people do this regularly and are quite successful at it. Ultimately, they find and exploit all such opportunities until no more are available. At that point, utility is maximized. There is no feasible state of affairs that could be preferable to the one attained. Okay. Subjectivity of utility implies that we cannot know how much utility an individual derives from something. But in economic life, we regularly see people buying things. iPhones or John Grisham potboilers, for example, and giving good money to do so. But if they are maximizers, which of course we assume them to be, they obviously are buying those things because they expect to get at least as much utility from them as they would get from spending the money on other things. So an individual's willingness to pay for something is taken to be an indication of the utility she expects to derive from its enjoyment, or in other words, the strength of her preference for it. Okay. This turns out to be very important, as we shall see. Price, what people are willing to pay for something, is an expression of the strength of their preference for it, or the utility they expect to derive from it. And that is a very important principle arising out of this notion. The undifferentiatedness of utility has several implications that are important for this discussion. One is that people deal with choices in political, social, and personal realms in the same way that they do with choices that are explicitly economic. For example, economists believe that in voting, people seek to maximize their personal utility. This, of course, is what leads to the claim that economics explains everything. Everything, it turns out, is all choice-making behavior. Okay. A second important implication is that non-commercial things have economic value. We may not have to pay anything to fall in love, but if forced to, we would be willing to. And that gives falling in love economic value. That is, it confers utility. Just like a donut from Krispy Kreme. This may seem rather strange to you, I'm sure it does, but it does suggest that economists think of economic value as a much more and a different and more expansive concept than commercial value. Okay. And places them in a position of finding economic value in the outcomes of public decisions that most people would never think was there. To an economist, climate stability, or uncluttered vistas, or the presence of wolves in the 9-mile valley west of Missoula all are economically valuable, and society is justified in incurring costs to capture that value. The account of the rational maximizing agent is subject to a variety of objections, some of which will already have occurred to you. For one thing, the subjectivity of utility makes the theory sound dangerously tautological. Consider this dialogue. You. Why did Joe choose that cheeseburger? Economist. Because it will make him better off. You. How do you know it will make him better off? Economist. Because he chose it. You. So he chose it because he chose it? Economist. Sorry, I'm afraid office hours are over. Okay. For another thing, maximizing utility doesn't sound like anything you or anyone you know does or can do when they go to the store or otherwise make choices. The data and computational resources required are simply too great. Some scholars, known as behavioral economists, have examined in detail decision-making behavior empirically, and utility maximization rarely fares well in the outcome. In 2002, Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist, won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Talk about poaching on intellectual territory. In economics for a very large body of work that tends to demonstrate that rational maximization is seriously circumscribed. Yet another problem is figuring out just where preferences come from. Why is it that we believe what we do about the ability of things to make us better off? Economists typically assume that the preference function is just there. It's exogenous, without worrying about where it comes from and how it is formed and altered by culture, experience, technology, and so forth. But of course, the utility function is not just there. We learn for our preferences from social influences and norms, technology, and experience. And Kahneman, again, has reported experimental evidence that this learning doesn't go well. Okay. Subjects consistently misremember the pleasure of events. Actually, the experiments dealt with pain, but Kahneman assumes that memories of pleasure and pain behave symmetrically, and therefore can be expected to derive a dysfunctional set of preferences from experience. Subjects also routinely report that the pleasure that they derive from goods tends to match their expectations when the goods are first acquired, but then begins to fade. This has been called the hedonic treadmill. Albert Borgman of the University of Montana Philosophy Department has argued that technology leads us away from the kind of engagement of our minds and energies that makes for the good life, and into sterile consumption. We don't cook dinner, we open a bag of chips. We don't look at the mountains around us or the moon or stars above us to tell us where we are. We look at a GPS. At the bottom of the Grand Canyon, we don't listen to the canyon wrens. We call our broker on a satellite phone. Were I to apply the terminology of utility theory to Albert's argument, which I probably shouldn't do, he'd probably hate it, but I would say that utility maximization is an illusion, because technology and culture so distort our preferences and desires, which become so destructive and dysfunctional, they no longer serve us as a reliable guide to making decisions that will benefit us. I think, by the way, that it strikes me that Albert's argument is in some ways similar to what Thorstein Veblen was saying over 100 years ago, Thorstein Veblen, an institutional economist, who argued that, that technology and culture suppressed what he called the instinct for workmanship and elevated conspicuous consumption. And it seems to me that those are sort of similar types of concepts. Finally, rational maximization requires that people consider trade-offs that they are often flat out unwilling to contemplate. There may be parents who would be willing to trade their kids for a sufficient number of pork chop dinners, but most, I suspect, would punch you in the nose for even bringing the subject up. So where does all this get us when it comes to defining the role of economics in public debates about scientific issues? First of all, if benefit, or utility if you will, if the benefit we derive from goods and services we acquire in markets determines how much we are willing to pay for them, and if our willingness to pay for goods and services constitutes the incentive to firms to acquire the resources to produce them, it follows that in a wide variety of situations, resources will be guided into the production of things that provide us with the greatest possible material benefits. Another way of saying it is that markets are efficient. They generate high outputs, benefit, per unit of input resources. And economists love efficiency. What does this have to do with public debates about science? Many economists would argue that there are some issues that are really not worthy of public debate at all. In their view, all that is at stake in these cases is efficiency. And efficiency will be best achieved by individuals acting on their own in markets. Okay. Consider this example. Yesterday's New York Times reported on a lively debate, which, and by the way, it also appeared briefly in the Missoulian today, which has been going on for some time now concerning whether or not older men should submit to an annual PSA exam for prostate cancer. The benefit of doing so is that if undetected, prostate cancer will cause some men to die much sooner than they otherwise would. On the other hand, a large share of prostate cancers will not have this result. Indeed, a majority of men over 80 who die of something else will have prostate cancer, and many will have had it for a good long while. So the PSA test is going to reveal a lot of cancers that really would not be a problem and lead to a lot of cancer treatments that really aren't necessary. So what, you might say? Why take a chance? The answer is that the treatment is expensive and disturbing side effects are common. So is PSA testing a good idea or not? Should there be a public debate among physicians and medical scientists about this question? An economist would probably say there should not be. What scientists should do is make sure that men have the best information possible about the risks and outcomes, and then let those men make their own subjective evaluations of those risks and outcomes and decide whether or not they want the test. No one can second guess these decisions, and there's no need for public resolution of the issue. Incidentally, the Times reports that according to the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, men over 75 should not routinely undergo a PSA test. That's over 75. When I read this, talked to my wife last night, and she said, "You make economists sound like libertarians." I said, "Oh, precisely." Precisely. There is a bias. There is a sort of in the intellectual structure of economics, there is a bias towards that sort of brand of libertarianism, and of course there are many economists, well-known economists who are libertarians. Perhaps the most notable example would be Milton Friedman. But let me emphasize that what the argument that's being made here about the value of these sort of independent, unconstrained individual decisions is efficiency. It's not something about political freedom that's involved. Now you can, and I will object to my PSA example on several grounds, but the point still stands. In public debates about scientific issues or any issues that matter, economists will insist that we should avoid substituting our judgments about what is good for people for their own judgments. Economists take seriously the Latin adage, de gustibus non est disputandum. There is no disputing tastes. Now, we can all agree that for many reasons we should, of course, respect the autonomy of individuals, and we should, of course, not barge into people's lives telling them what's good for them, but it does happen. Okay. Economists regard this substitution of judgment as inappropriate because they want public decisions to be efficient, which can only be the case when they conform to the needs and preferences of the affected parties as they themselves express them, supposing the affected parties to be competent adults. But returning to Albert Borgman's argument, if competent adults' preferences are demonstrably dysfunctional, then it may well be that someone knows better what's good for them than they do themselves. And that knowledge should be brought to bear in public debate, at least on efficiency grounds. On other grounds, such as respect for autonomy and privacy of individuals, it might still be excluded. Consider a concrete example: regulating snowmobile use in Yellowstone National Park. This is clearly a controversial issue, and economic, social, and ecologic arguments for both allowing and banning snowmobile use abound. For those of you who are not from here, we have a ski area called Snowbowl, and it's very hard for me to not say snowbowl when I'm trying to say snowmobile. I believe that proponents of a ban occasionally offer as an argument that snowmobiling is not good for the people who do it, that they would engage their minds and bodies in the experience of Yellowstone in the winter. They would better engage their minds and bodies in the experience of Yellowstone in the winter if they got off their high-speed, noisy, distracting machines and stepped onto a pair of skis or snowshoes instead. Does this argument belong in public debate? A convinced economist would reject it out of hand. I'm not sure what Albert Borgman would say. Leaving aside the economist's touching faith in the infinite wisdom of the rational maximizing agent, a reason not to make arguments of this type is that they are bound to be perceived as patronizing and insulting by people who ride snowmobiles. And I don't know whether Dane has made this clear or not, but he will eventually, I'm sure, during the course of this week. Patronization and insult are not among the virtues of an ethical deliberator. But then again, Albert's argument suggests that there may be a great deal at stake here, and we omit its consideration at our peril. I don't think this is a trivial matter. Arguments that involve the substitution of judgments are not just an occasional curiosity in public debates. And if we want to be skilled and effective deliberators, we need to know how we should regard them. So markets are great, aren't they? Well, for some things they're pretty good. But economists have also described a variety of common circumstances in which they fail. That is, in which they do not provide for the capture of net gains. There's something, cleaner air say, that's worth a great deal to us and which we could attain at minimal cost by installing pollution control equipment. Cleaning up the air would therefore result in significant net gains. But there is no market that will make it happen. Collective action is required. So here is an important point. From the point of view of economics, the purpose of and justification for collective action is to capture net economic gains. That is, to enhance the efficiency with which we use and manage our resources. And when it comes to debating alternative courses of action with respect to climate change or biotechnology or nanotechnology policies, the preferred alternative is the one that enhances efficiency the most. You may not like it, but there it is. Left to our own devices, economists would resolve critical public debates by appealing to the efficiency characteristics of the alternatives. We obviously need to think about this a bit, but before we do, let me offer this aside. Some time ago, Ronald Coase, a Nobel laureate in economics, wrote a very influential paper entitled The Problem of Social Cost, in which he argued that market failure is the result of high transactions costs. Consider the air pollution example. The value to the public of cleaning up the air is greater than the cost to the polluter of installing pollution control equipment. Why doesn't the public pay the polluter to clean up? Because the thousands and thousands of individual transactions that would have to occur would each be costly, but individually would capture a very small share of the total benefit to be realized. Just imagine, for example, that we all decided that we were going to try and pay each other not to drive each other's cars because we were polluting each other's air. We'd have to have a big, huge meeting down in Kiwanis Park, and I'd have to figure out how much you were polluting my air, and you'd have to figure out how much I was polluting yours, and we'd have to negotiate the price. And in the end, what would we have gained? Hardly anything. Okay. So the transactions costs prohibit our actually engaging in that kind of outcome. So it doesn't happen. The philosopher Carl Sagoff has pointed out that what Coase's argument really implies is that there's no such thing as market failure at all. If the benefits of cleaning up the air don't outweigh the combined cost of pollution control equipment and the transactions costs required to get that equipment installed, efficiency requires that the air not be cleaned up. Okay. The market has done the efficient thing, has therefore not failed. So Sagoff says, if markets can't fail, there is no economic justification for collective action. Okay. And considerations of efficiency can have no bearing on public debates, which must therefore be resolved on other terms. The economists will please leave the forum immediately. Please refrain from saying, "Oh, thank God," at this point, because I think there's a flaw in Sagoff's argument, and he and you are not going to get rid of me all that easily. What can we say about efficiency as a value in debating scientific issues? Well, for one thing, it should not be dismissed as trivial or irrelevant in the light of our larger purposes. In a society as affluent as ours, it appears unseemly, even greedy, to worry about squeezing ever more out of resources. But there are plenty of places around the world where becoming more efficient by improving the productivity of land or of resources or of people may mean the difference between surviving and not. This surely is not something we should lose sight of when we debate, for example, the international distribution of genetically modified crops. Let me come at this point from another direction. Consider policies intended to reduce carbon emissions in compliance with the Kyoto Accords. Broadly speaking, there are two major approaches to the design of such policies. One involves the mandating and/or encouraging of specific carbon-lowering strategies, such as the production of biofuels and wind energy, higher mandatory fuel efficiency standards for vehicles, mandatory sequestration of carbon at conventionally fueled power plants, and so forth. The other involves the capping of carbon emissions and permitting the trading of emissions allowances among capped sources of emissions, so that a source that emits less than its cap can sell the difference to another that will emit more than its cap. There are all kinds of reasons to like or dislike these alternative approaches. And by the way, if you come tonight, you'll hear more about this, because we're going to be talking about the policy proposals of McCain and Obama, which involve both of these things. That is, they don't necessarily regard them as fully alternative to one another, which is the way I'm representing them here. There are all kinds of reasons to dislike or dislike these alternative approaches, and surely we have an occasion here to debate. In fact, it's 7 tonight. An economist entering the debate would say that the second policy, cap and trade, is highly preferable on efficiency grounds. The reason is that under cap and trade, emissions reductions will be undertaken by those who can do so most efficiently and at least cost, because then they can make money selling their excess allowances. While there is very little prospect that the mix of strategies called for under the first, more directive policy would be similarly optimal. Now, however we do it, complying with the Kyoto Accords is going to be costly. So costly, indeed so costly, according to the President, that he has simply rejected compliance with Kyoto out of hand. But if cost is going to make or break our response to climate change, then we should listen to economists carefully. Unless we have efficient policies, we may have no policies at all. Okay. And I say that if you look at the politics of what happened in the deliberations over the Warner-Lieberman climate change bill in the Senate, there was a huge outpouring of political opposition to that bill coming from principally large business interests, the National Association of Manufacturers, and they went around the country saying that if we had that Warner-Lieberman bill in place, that was a cap and trade bill, the cost to the economy would be disastrous. And they mobilized a great deal of political opposition, and of course the bill never even got to be debated on the floor of the Senate. It couldn't get the 60 votes to break cloture. So it was never even debated on the floor of the Senate. So this issue of cost is indeed very important. Unless we have efficient policies, then we may have no policies at all. I should mention here that cap and trade is no substitute for political will. The European Union installed a cap and trade system, but then was unable to bring itself to set the caps low enough to make any difference. So that in that case, despite having an efficient policy, in effect they had no policy at all. The application of efficiency analysis to the design of emissions reduction policies is fairly straightforward. It assumes that we have already decided whatever it costs, reducing emissions is worth it. Being efficient in this context simply means getting the cost as low as possible. But if they had their way, economists would probably prefer to formulate the problem differently. They would ask whether the benefits of reducing emissions, which are the avoided costs of uncontrolled climate change, outweigh the control costs, or perhaps whether it would be more efficient to let emissions continue as they otherwise would, but allow climate change to occur as it otherwise would, and adapt to it. What economists are asking here is asking us to do is to strike a reasonable, which to an economist means efficient, balance between adapting and arresting climate change. Now, every instinct you may have tells you to reject this balancing act. Surely this madness must stop. But it's too late. Adaptation is far from hypothetical. Climate change is occurring and we are adapting. Climate change is going to continue to occur and we are going to have to continue to adapt. Can cost-benefit analysis tell us how far down this road we should go? Well, maybe. But there are some serious problems. One is that while the idea of comparing the economic magnitudes of costs and benefits is sensible enough, when it actually comes to establishing those magnitudes, all bets are off. What dollar sign can we put on the disappearance of Arctic sea ice? What about the loss of the way of life for the indigenous peoples who hunt on that ice, or the polar bears that live on it? What is the value that will be lost, or perhaps gained, as Miami goes slowly underwater? That's obviously a biased northwestern kind of view, you know. As Miami goes slowly underwater. Trout in Montana are threatened by rising water temperatures and diminished in-stream flow. What's the value of a healthy trout population? And so forth. It turns out that fools rush in, and economists have indeed developed many techniques intended to establish these kinds of values. Remember, willingness to pay is the key here. But the results are discouraging in their implausibility, variability, and inconsistency across measuring techniques. More to the point, relatively few people involved in the debate about how we should respond to climate change regard these measures of value as valid or legitimate. It is also difficult to conduct a cost-benefit analysis of alternative strategies for responding to climate change when there is so much uncertainty about what is going to happen, when decisions can have irreversible consequences, and when many of the parties affected by the decisions we make today are not around to express their preferences or willingness to pay. It's true that economists have devised a variety of ways to deal with all these flies in the ointment, but their applicability to the climate change problem at hand is not very robust. A final and to my mind most telling objection to applying cost-benefit analysis in public debates is that in some circumstances it is inappropriate or irrelevant. This is because there are other values, principles, or convictions involved in deciding the issue that trump efficiency. Carl Sagoff, in another paper than the one I referred to earlier, makes this point forcefully with respect to the Endangered Species Act. Why, Sagoff asks, do we require government to do whatever it must to protect endangered species almost without regard to the cost of doing so? Is it because we know that the economic value of the continued existence of a species is necessarily greater than the cost of protecting it? To Sagoff, the answer is pretty clearly no. Okay. We protect species because we have an obligation to do so. I will leave to the ethicists to explain where that obligation comes from. But the obligation doesn't cease to exist just because it's costly to live with. Okay. When is it appropriate to consider efficiency and when it's not strikes me as an interesting problem in debating public issues. It seems to me that there are clear-cut instances in which decisions should be made mostly or entirely on efficiency grounds. Okay. Should we produce apples or oranges? Well, for Pete's sake, produce whatever it is that customers want and are willing to pay for. Okay. At the other end of the scale, there are cases, like Sagoff's example of endangered species, where efficiency shouldn't count at all. It doesn't make any difference how much people are willing to pay for a round of golf. We're just not going to destroy grizzly bear habitat to build a golf course on it. Notice, by the way, that there's no unanimity on this last point. Okay. There are plenty of developers who would like to see the ESA itself become extinct. It's in cases between these two extremes when you are going to have to figure out whether economics is relevant to the debates before you. Consider this one. About the time that An Inconvenient Truth was winning the Oscar, it was revealed that Al Gore was using an awful lot of energy to heat and light his great big house in Tennessee. Gore defended himself by announcing that he purchases carbon offsets, meaning that for every pound of carbon that he is responsible for putting into the atmosphere, he pays somebody somewhere to take a pound of carbon out. To me, as an economist, this is the sensible, efficient thing to do. Strictly voluntarily, the guy wants to reduce his carbon footprint to zero. Remember, strictly voluntarily. He has two ways to do it. Turn off all his lights, or pay somebody else to plant trees or build a wind farm or what have you. He chooses the second way because he regards it as more convenient and therefore less costly, at least subjectively less costly. What can possibly be wrong with that? Well, according to Charles Krauthammer, writing in Time magazine, Gore is simply buying an indulgence, forgiveness for the sin of excess carbon emissions. Even Michael Kingsley, again in Time, poses the question that if it's okay to buy an offset for carbon emissions, what about a child abuse offset? Obviously, if you think that emitting carbon is the moral equivalent of beating up a child, you aren't going to find cost-benefit analysis of much use in dealing with the problem. And some people do. Some people do. Some people say, you have an obligation to clean up your own mess and not pay somebody else to clean it up for you. There are all sorts of values, imperatives, convictions, and obligations that might supersede efficiency as a consideration in public debates, but among these, the one about which economics might be expected to have the most to say is equity. That is, the question of who shall bear the costs and who shall enjoy the benefits of the decisions we make. What can economists say about equity? Almost every collective choice we make that alters the economy in some significant way creates winners and losers. Economists specifically disavow any special knowledge about whether the pattern of gains and losses is appropriate, fair, or just. Take that question down the hall to the philosophy department. More importantly, you guys got a lot to do. More importantly, given that utility is entirely subjective, there's no way of comparing it from one person to the next. Which means that it is impossible to say that if a particular redistribution of income is efficient or not. Even if we take $100 from Bill Gates, who wouldn't appear to need it, okay, and give it to an impoverished graduate student, this is supposed to resonate with at least many of you here, who's subsisting on PB&J sandwiches, we don't know whether the total utility experienced by the two of them together has risen or fallen, because we can't compare your gains to Bill's losses. That may seem like a rather serious limitation. Yeah, no kidding. But consider this corollary. To know that a collective decision that we have made is going to raise total utility, that is going to enhance efficiency, there either have to be no losers at all, which is rare, or the winners have to be able to fully compensate the losers and have something left over for themselves. In other words, any efficient decision is potentially equitable. That is, any efficient decision potentially contains the means of compensating anybody who's going to lose from it, provided the appropriate mechanisms for paying compensation are in place. That's a big provided that. In practice, of course, compensation is rarely forthcoming. We see it occasionally, as when, in conjunction with entering into free trade agreements, we establish assistance programs for workers displaced by cheaper imported goods. But usually compensation remains little more than the twinkle in the eye of the winners. When, under the NAFTA agreement, imports of U.S. corn wiped out impoverished corn producers in central and southern Mexico, farmers in Iowa weren't sending checks to their counterparts in Chiapas. Efficient choices can then lead to unjust outcomes. And when they do, we are often inclined to make less efficient choice with a fairer distribution of consequences. Indeed, if you pay attention to the debates about the economics of global warming or globalization, you will hear a great deal about who is going to benefit and who is going to suffer, but very little about efficiency. It's interesting that implicit in these arguments is the assumption that more is better, but little attention is paid to efficiency, which is the most important way of getting more. One important way in which economists can participate in discussions about equity is in clarifying who the winners and losers really are. In this regard, things are seldom what they seem. We have a tendency to assess the results of our decisions by focusing on their proximal impacts, and to ignore how those impacts are suffused through the economy in a network of market and transactions. For example, when we require coal-fired power plants to sequester carbon dioxide, which of course we're not doing yet, but this is in the future when and if we require coal-fired power plants to sequester carbon dioxide, we are inclined to believe that it is the power company that is the power company that will bear the costs, which seems fair. Excuse me, I lost my place. We tend to ignore the fact that the company will succeed in shifting a good deal of the burden to its customers, or to the ranchers from whom they lease the coal, or to the railroad that transports the coal, or to the workers in the power plant. Figuring out all of these effects is not easy, but if you want to bring them into the debate, and I think you should bring them into the debate, an economist should be brought in as well. Another aspect of the discussion of equity which I think you should be aware of is what economists call rent seeking. This is when private interests go to government and the community at large seeking arrangements that will raise their incomes. For example, a pharmaceutical company seeks to extend a patent over a drug or secure cooperation of the government in enforcing its patent rights in other countries. AIDS drugs in Africa, perhaps. Now, nobody ever admits to rent seeking. Please do this so I can be richer. No, you don't say that. Rather, they represent the arrangement they seek as serving some public interest, including equity. The rent they seek is represented as something that by community standards they deserve as a matter of fairness. Sometimes, of course, they do. But separating the wheat from the chaff in these claims is tough going. In my involvement with these kinds of issues, I have been impressed by the ease with which the line between patently special interests, genuinely public interests, and the attainment of equity gets blurred by those who benefit from blurring it. This brings me to my last point. You may now moan, oh thank God, if you wish. It is this. Quite often, way too often really, the economics that's brought to bear on public debates consists of economic impact analysis, rather than efficiency or equity analysis. In impact analysis, some variable is chosen, usually it's jobs or wages. The impact of different alternatives on that variable are calculated, and the alternative with the biggest impact is preferred. Should a ridge in the mountains to the south of Missoula become a ski area or be left undeveloped and wild? Well, let's see. Are there more jobs in skiing or in outfitting? Oh, skiing. Well, there's your answer. Crude but amazingly effective. This example is not hypothetical. The first thing to be said about impact analysis is that it's almost always horribly wrong, and the impacts are grotesquely exaggerated. Grotesque in this context means roughly 1 order of magnitude. And I'm not kidding. That's the kind of exaggeration you frequently see. The second thing to notice about impact analysis is that it dresses itself up as cost-benefit analysis because impacts, more jobs, for example, are seen to be good things, benefits. The lunacy of this association of cost-benefit with cost-benefit analysis is not hard to discern. Across the West this summer, and particularly in California, hundreds of workers have risked their health and lives to fight wildfires, which are arguably more severe due to climate change. So climate change creates jobs, and that's good for us. Okay. In cost-benefit analysis, jobs are costs, not benefits. If a farmer asked you whether planting wheat or sunflower seeds represented the highest and best use of his land, would you tell him to plant the one that takes the most work? Is growing the economy really a benefit in a community whose principal preoccupation is the costs of growth? Why are impacts treated as though they were synonymous with benefits? More often than not, it's because the impact estimates are being produced by rent seekers, who, as I have said, have a vested interest in blurring the line between what is good for them and what is good for the larger community. That also explains why the impacts are grotesquely exaggerated. Impact analysis is probably the most common and well-received way that economics is brought to bear on public debates and decision-making, which is odd because it is also the line of analysis which is least grounded in the fundamental structure of economic theory that I attempted to describe at the beginning of this talk. I hope that I've given you something to chew on here. I am not going to try and wrap it all up with a few well-chosen words. I will stop at this point and throw it open to your comments, questions, and discussion. Yeah.
You keep mentioning willingness to pay, but I wonder if ability to pay ever enters into the equations, because if I have no money, I can't say that I like to pay for it.
Willingness to pay, the notion of willingness to pay encompasses ability as well. So that nobody would ever say if you can't afford something, if you say, well, if you can't afford it, the economists would say you're not willing to pay for it.
Right.
Right.
So it becomes theoretical. If I was a millionaire, sure, I'd be willing to pay for X, Y, and Z.
No. For example, if economists are trying to elicit statements of willingness to pay for, let's say, well, I've had a student, for example, who studied the use of private automobiles in Yosemite National Park. And the question was, what would people be willing to pay to have a public transportation system there and avoid the congestion and damage and so forth? And so you interview people, and you ask them what they're willing to pay, and it becomes hypothetical or theoretical in the sense that since you're asking a hypothetical question, you might get a hypothetical answer. But if you talk to somebody who doesn't have much income, and so they say, well, no, I wouldn't be willing to pay $10 for it, that just goes into the calculation. And so I interview a whole bunch of people. Some people are willing to pay 100, some people are willing to pay 10. It doesn't make any difference whether it's they're willing to pay 10 or 100 because of a difference in their income or because of a difference in their preferences. It's all going to get what the economist is going to try and come up with is what's the average willingness to pay, and we're going to multiply that by the number of affected individuals, and that's going to be the value of prohibiting the use of automobiles in the park. The question of hypotheticalness, however, is one of the difficult questions in that kind of economic research. That technique is called contingent valuation. It's widely used in environmental economics, contingent valuation techniques. And there are methods that are, there are ways of asking the question that that limit the extent of hypothetical bias more than other ways. So that, for example, the preferred format for the question is not to ask somebody, what would you be willing to pay? The preferred format is to ask somebody, would you be willing to pay $5? And of course, you can't ask everybody, would you be willing to pay $5? You ask some people, would you be willing to pay $100, and other people $2, and other people $35, and so forth. And by looking at the distributions of yes and no's and assuming something about the distribution of values, you can estimate the mean. Yeah?
I really appreciate the way you kind of hit on the head, asking whether growth is necessarily a good thing or whether a job is a cost or
Uh-huh.
benefit. But clearly, if I need a job, I want a job, it is a benefit to me.
Yes.
And so something happens between the job being a benefit to me and the job, the need to provide jobs being a cost to the farmer or something.
Yeah.
So at what point does something happen?
Well, I think that that what is involved there is when you look at it at the level of society, as the society, rather than at what the individual is may be thinking about. Usually the implicit assumption is that if these jobs weren't created, these people wouldn't be doing anything else. Okay. So, and if that were true, then it would be appropriate probably to think about jobs as benefits, or at least it would be, at least the number of jobs that would be created would be some kind of rough measure of benefit. But in general, in the macro economy, that's probably not true. I mean, it's not the case that any one specific project that you're looking at is going to affect the overall level of employment. I mean, there's going to be the effect of that is swamped by whatever the labor market is doing otherwise. So jobs. So when you're talking about creating jobs one place, you're talking about people working here rather than there, okay? And obviously, if you're talking about a community where there's, say, chronic high unemployment, then job creation is of some kind of benefit. But when you're talking about a community like, say, Missoula, Montana, okay? And you say, if we build a ski area on Lolo Peak or Carlton Ridge, it's going to create 2,000 or 3,000 jobs. You know that those jobs are going to be taken by people who are going to come from somewhere else in the country where they could have been working there. So we're not looking at a situation where we're creating jobs for desperate people who need them. We're looking at a situation where we're creating jobs that people may somewhat prefer to the jobs that they could have somewhere else. There was a very influential article back in the 50s. Arthur Lewis wrote an article about the idea of economic development with unlimited supplies of labor. And he was looking at labor surplus economies in which there were large numbers of workers who essentially they were so crowded into the agricultural sector of the economy that their productivity was down to nothing. Okay, and if you move those people into other places, where they could be more productive. There would be those jobs would be benefits, if you could create jobs there. But sort of at the margin, when you're talking about moving 2,000 workers from, I don't know, Washington, Eastern Montana, California, wherever, to come and run a ski area, you're not talking about the situation you're referring to, yeah.
So I just want some information, so I don't know a lot about what goes on in the field of economics. Is there a group that's working on modeling such that if we reduced our CO2 emissions to 300 parts per million versus 383 as it is now, or reduce it to 250 parts per million, what that would look like in terms of cars, or this fewer amount of cars, and we're going to be substituting these transportation systems with these over here, and in China this is going to happen, in India this would have to happen, and sort of trying to come up with alternate models such that the carbon footprint would be much smaller, and take into account all the regional variations. It's really, really complex, and then start to figure out what will be like literally workable, what people would be willing to scale down in terms of their quality of life or their income, and if everybody scales down the same way, then people are okay with that because they have to issue keeping up with the Joneses, and so.
No. Now you went too far. Economists will not do that. Will not routinely model that aspect of the problem into their models. That is to say, the aspect of the problem that if we're all in the same boat, we will not hurt quite so much from the restriction in income as if we. No.
But that's empirically been pretty well justified.
There's been a lot that's been empirically justified. I've tried to indicate that. Well, yeah, but to answer your question, I'm not sure that these research groups have hit on all of the points that you made. But yes, there are a number of research groups that have tried to assess what will happen in the economy as a result of, say, well, the studies that I've seen, specifically, what would happen if you were going to meet the targets in Warner Lieberman, which require bringing down emissions to 70% below their 1990 levels by 2050. And generally speaking, there are two broad approaches to that. One approach is what we call a microeconomic approach, and that is where a group of researchers will say, what are the technical and engineering and financial possibilities here for reducing emissions? How can we do it, technically speaking? What are the engineering characteristics of that, and what does it cost? Pretty interesting results. That is that. At least one of those studies that I've seen, which was commissioned by the Natural Resources Defense Council, suggests that you could get half of the emissions reductions that you would be looking for under Warner Lieberman at negative financial cost. In other words, you'd say through efficiency, conservation, and so forth, you'd save more money than it would cost to do whatever it is you do. You put in compact fluorescence and you save that much money. You retrofit a building and so forth, so that you could get halfway there and actually have positive net returns, financial net returns. Then, if you went the rest of the way, the positive returns from getting the first half would pay for the negative returns that would be the costs that would be involved in getting the second half. So those are saying it's essentially costless. To the economy to do those kinds of things, and it identifies specific strategies that have to be undertaken. Now, it doesn't deal necessarily with interregional effects or interpersonal effects or anything of that sort. The other generally broad approach, the approach that was taken, for example, by the modelers who worked for the National Association of Manufacturers to estimate the impact of Warner Lieberman, showed that there would be, they model a whole bunch of things in this. They model employment effects, they model price effects on gasoline and so forth. But it's a more macroeconomic kind of a model. They just impose the restrictions, and then they plug those emissions restrictions into the model and the model itself sort of tries to sort out where are those emissions reductions, mandated emissions reductions going to be achieved, how much is it going to cost, so forth, what's it going to do to the impact, to the rate of growth of the economy, and so on. When they do that, and the numbers, like for 2050, come out to be pretty big, okay? And the National Association of Manufacturers said, we're going around the country. They have road shows. They had one in Billings here in Montana, showing how many millions of dollars or billions of dollars or whatever it was going to cost to meet these requirements by 2050. But if you looked at it carefully, actually, if you project the growth of the economy out to 2050, the numbers just get surreal, and it turns out that even on the basis of those estimates, national income, which is a rough measure of the standard of living, national income in 2050 would be about 1 year behind where it would otherwise be if you didn't have Warner Lieberman in place. In other words, you put Warner Lieberman in place and people have to wait all the way to 2051 to have the standard of living that they otherwise could have had in 2050.
So what's the counter argument?
No, that is their argument. There's no counter argument. What are you talking about? No. What?
Into the micro analysis.
Oh, well, it's a difference in technique, really. The microeconomic analysis is fairly static, so that the microeconomic analysis says, you have these costs, but it doesn't make any attempt to show what the impact of those costs will be on the rate of growth and so forth.
Let me make a couple of announcements. Dick's paper, for the students here, we're going to put it up on the ODC. So you can access it there on the main page if you'd like to read it again. For those of you in the audience who would like his paper, email the center. And with Dick's permission, we'll send it to you. You can find our website. It's just the University of Montana's website, /ethics. And you can get to our website. So thank you for coming, and thanks to Dick again.